Hello everyone, today's hobby video is a painting tutorial for the mighty Rogal Dorn battle tank. As you can see, it's using a single paint colour scheme in Mechanicus standard grey, and throughout the painting tutorial I use different paints from different companies including GW, Vallejo and AK Interactive to name a few. In the description below will be all the paints I use, and as you can see it's a relatively straightforward paint scheme that allows you to really focus in on the weathering and the finer detail, so let's get into it. Okay, to start I've painted all of the tracks still on the sprue, matte black by Army Painter, and I've just used a paintbrush to get this on the tracks themselves. You could also use a spray can and use Citadel Chaos Black, but I've just done it with a paintbrush. I then used Gunmetal, also by Army Painter, to carefully paint the tracks, and you can see I've left what are probably the rubber pads on the tracks exposed in matte black. So go along with your paintbrush and be somewhat careful as you apply this gunmetal. And then next we move on to using Corvus Black by Citadel. Here I'm painting over the rubber padding that I spoke about before, and you do this carefully, not getting this onto any of the gunmetal grey. Once it's all dry, I then use Nuln oil by Citadel, and what I'm doing here is carefully putting it around the rubber pads. This will help to sort of sharpen them up, and as you paint this area, you'll notice there's a bit of a divot here, a bit of like a recess around the pads themselves. So to help sharpen up this point, I'm using Nuln oil to simply fill in the cracks in between the gunmetal grey and then the Corvus Black for the rubber pads on the tracks. Right, and to finish off the tracks, I'm then using Track Wash by AK Interactive. Now I've thinned this out using White Spirit, and this is a bit more of a browner finish or rustier finish on the tracks. I'm very carefully putting it over the metal parts only and not on the Corvus Black, and you can see I'm sort of using my finger here just to pick away at it. Now if you don't have access to AK Interactive products, you could simply just use Macragg's Earthshade by Citadel and mix it with some Nuln oil. Make sure you water it down, and what you're going for here is a bit more of a browner, rustier style finish to your tracks. And once this is all done and dry, just put it aside as we'll be gluing it onto the miniature at a later point. Right, now onto painting the wider miniature, and if you want to see how I assemble this, you can check out this link here. But I've sprayed the entire miniature with Mechanicus standard grey by Citadel, the spray paint rattle can. It's then using the dry brush technique, using Administratum grey also by Citadel to cover the entire miniature. And you can see the paintbrush I'm using is specific dry brush by Army Painter. It's got a nice big fat head, making this task a lot easier. You can use any old old paintbrush, but make sure it's got quite a big head, because this is quite a big miniature. So go over the entire miniature and dry brush with Admin Grey. Right, once that is done, you're then using a specific product I've got called Mud Splash Wash by MiG Productions. If you don't have this specific paint, you could use, of course, Reikland Flesh Shade by Citadel. And here you're carefully going about all the rivets, cracks, nuts and bolts over the course of the miniature. By no means, but the imaginations would you cover the entire miniature wholesale on this, but here you are very carefully picking up each of the rivets, cracks, nuts and bolts to basically replicate dust and dirt building up over the course of the model. And once that's all dry, you then go over again with your dry brush with Admin Grey to sort of reinforce all those sharp edges of the miniature. Right, now onto painting the suspension and road wheels. Using matte black again, I'm carefully painting the outside of the wheels. What I mean by the outside is you basically leave in the central aspect of the exposed wheel to be Mechanicus standard grey. As you look a bit deeper, there's also some suspension style components modelled in, so paint those with matte black. Do be more precise here as you're painting, trying to make sure you preserve any of the Mechanicus standard grey you want to leave in that colour, but if you do have some overflow, don't worry, because we're going to weather this component later and also use Nuln oil to clean up any of our boo-boos. Okay, now we're using a dry brush, using Gunmetal, again by Army Painter, and using a much more precise dry brush paintbrush, a smaller one. You can see I'm very carefully dry brushing all of the suspension style components in the deeper aspect of the miniature. So do apply this quite carefully. Just like with the black, if you get a bit of overflow in other parts of the paint, don't worry too much, because we're going to weather this, but very carefully dry brush all of the suspension components with a smaller dry brush for the task. Then using Nuln oil, and here you can go crazy just whacking it everywhere, so cover all of the actual road wheels and the suspension with Nuln oil. Okay, with that done, you can then glue and place the tracks. Super fun to sort of see the miniature come to life, but obviously follow the instructions as you glue them in place. And a key watch that I must make at this point is, given you painted these in the sprue, the sides of some of the tracks may be exposed plastic as you snip them out of the sprue. So you may have to either, before you put it on the miniature, or you can paint it on the miniature, just make sure you're tidying up any spots on the tracks which are exposed plastics where they've come away from the sprue. Now for a Leman Russ battle tank, if you follow the same method, it isn't a problem because the tracks are quite small, but given the tracks are quite fat in this instance, you will have to basically touch up any of the exposed plastic that's been cut away. But go about this and assemble all the tracks in place. Okay, now using matte black for some more detailed work. We're going to use matte black on several points of the miniature, and here use relevant paint brushes to be more precise as you apply the paint. As always, try to make sure you don't get it onto the Mechanicus down at greys. You want to keep the paint job looking quite crisp, but you're going to paint the two fuel drums in the back of the tank in matte black, also the exhaust pipes, the auto cannon on the main turret, and also with the actual the main cannon, if you look at the very end of it, there's a little bit of a ring there, paint that in black as well. There's then things like the actual the crew hatches, the exposed aspects on the top of the lids, the crew lids, paint those in black. Things like the antennas, the rear sort of step shelf on the back of the turret where the assistant gunner can go and fire the stubber on the back. Also things like the belly cannon, paint that black, and likewise also on the back of the smoke grenade launchers, there's some little caps, paint those in matte black as well. A fair bit of black to be done around the miniature, but do be very precise as you apply this matte black, as you don't want to get it onto Mechanicus and a grey. But of course, if you make any boo-boos, use Mechanicus and a grey out of a paint pot to touch up any of your mistakes. Okay, now we crack out Gunmetal again, and here we're doing some dry brushing to start. So we dry brush the exhaust pipes. Now dry brushing gives a bit of a different finish as opposed to just painting them. So dry brush the exhaust pipes. Also dry brush the front little lip on the end of the barrel of the main cannon. You also then dry brush the belly cannon. So depending if I'm using the demolisher cannon or the Gatling cannon, dry brush that with your silver and then swap onto a normal paintbrush. Now here you need to paint silver. On the fuel drums, there's these like metal clasps on the top and bottom, paint those in silver. Then also paint, of course, the auto cannon. And also the crew hatches as well, yeah? So whilst you painted the top lids black, the inside of the lids, now paint them in gunmetal. And also you'll notice on the front of the tank, there's like this little spring system at the very front of the tank, looks like suspension. Paint those in silver as well. So with that black and silver all done, it's then more detailed work. And now using Rhino Hide by Citadel, you're painting the straps that hold in place the fuel drums, which are obviously at the back of the miniature. I then use True Copper by Army Painter to paint the Aquillas, which are of course above the belly cannon on the main turret weapon, both above the weapon and also the skulls on either side of the weapon. And then also the back of the model, of course, where the Aquila is on the outside of the exhaust grille. And staying at the back, we're then using Fire Dragon Bright by Citadel. It's like an orange on what must be the indicators on the back of the model. Okay, now for Macragge Blue, and here we're going through all of the headlamps and also the spotlight, which is on top of the turret. Okay, now onto Mephiston Red, and here we're painting the sensors. So the sensor on the upper left-hand side of the turret, on the right-hand side, which is like that sort of triangle-looking thing, and also in between the autocannon and the main cannon is a sensor as well. So paint this in Mephiston Red, again being very, very precise as you apply this paint. Then onto Nuln Oil, and again, we're basically sharpening all of the work we've just done. So basically very carefully go over everything you've just painted with the detailed work, including the wrist straps, any silver aspects, the Aquillas, even the sensors that you've all painted. Go over with a bit more of a detailed brush and carefully paint the Nuln Oil around the detail. As you can see, as I'm going through each of these aspects here, it helps to tidy up and tighten basically all of the detail work you've done. So use a very small brush and apply Nuln Oil on basically everything you've just done with the detail painting work. Okay, now we make some of this detail pop, and the first thing I'm focusing on using a very, very fine brush is the headlamps and also the spotlight. So firstly, I start with a Alaitoc blue, which is a lighter blue by Citadel, and I'm very carefully splotching it right in the central aspects of each of the grid style areas of the headlamps and the other spotlight. Then you repeat the process using a much, much smaller dab of Temple Guard Blue by Citadel. So basically you're working your way down in size and in the center of each of the grids on the spotlights and the headlamps. Also, don't forget, I may have forgotten before, but there are of course also some observation windows around the turret. So basically doing the same thing here. We started off with a darker blue and basically working your way down to the lighter blue and finishing off also with a very small line of temple guard blue along the bottom of these little windows. And to finish off the blue, I'm then using Drakennhof Nightshade by Citadel. It's another shade, and basically splotch it on very carefully. It's to sort of reinforce all of the edges around all of the spotlights and headlamps. Right, next on to the Mephiston rib, which we're then going to tighten up with some orange fire by Game Color. Now this is a very bright red. You could use anything by Citadel, but using your very smallest brush, you're basically picking out the edges of the thing on the top right hand side, and for the actual sensors in between the main weapons and also on the left hand side, you're basically painting the very middle of the little circles in this bright red. Now for any of the black elements, use Corvus black, and you're basically painting around the edges of the fuel canisters on the back of the miniature, and then also around the rings that are on the autocannon. So using Corvus black, you're basically tightening up the edges of the matte black that's exposed. And the final piece of highlighting work is actually using gunmetal again. Now using a very small paintbrush, a very precise one, you can see I'm carefully picking out the clasps on the back of the fuel canisters. I'm basically doing all the edges of the silver to make them just sort of be a bit more reinforced and not too dull, having seen you've just applied Nuln oil to all of it. Of course, do the same thing to the antennas, the crew hatch doors with the exposed sort of handles, and likewise also the fuel caps as well on the back of the miniature. So just go around and tighten up any of the silver with gunmetal in exposed areas which are looking a bit dull. Right, so believe it or not, that's all the detail work done. Now we're back onto dry brushing. So here we're going to take a smaller dry brush and use matte black and basically dry brush on the exhaust pipes to give them a bit more of a sooty look. You don't want this tank looking too clean, so basically dry brush the bottom of the exhaust pipes to get a bit more of a sooty look. You then actually do the main weapon, so the left and right and the muzzle brake. You basically dry brush it to sort of show as the weapon's been fired or the fumes coming out of that barrel. So do it left and right and go quite heavy here because you want to look like it's had a lot of shots fired out of it. You'll then also do the same thing to the belly cannon, which I don't show, but I like to do the outside of the belly cannon on the surrounding Mechanicus integrated, make it look like it's been fired quite a few times. Okay, very finally is weathering the miniature. Here you've applied all of the transfers or decals onto the miniature. Make sure this is done before you start this process. What I'm using now is a piece of packing sponge, or you could even use some kitchen sponge, of course, making sure it's nice and clean, and dabbing it onto some matte black. I've then taken most of it off the sponge by dabbing it on some paper towelette, and now you're basically going over the entire miniature and all the edges, and basically applying what appears to be damage or wear and tear. Now it's up to you how aggressive you go here. You can be super aggressive, make it look really chipped and damaged, but I go for more of a moderate, maybe a couple of months in the field type of look. But this is up to you. Make sure you go around all the edges, so any obvious areas like where the crew are coming in and out of the turret, make sure any handles or grab points are done quite well, and likewise the edges on the front of the tank. They have to always be done quite aggressively, because obviously they hit things as they move through the battlefield. And following the same principle, we then do the same thing again, but this time with gunmetal. Now here you're basically applying over any aspects you've done in the black already, and you're being a bit more sparse, a bit more careful as you apply this. This basically shows where the paintwork has been scratched all the way to the metal of the actual the tank. So of course be a bit more careful as you apply this around. Alright, so at this point the miniature is actually finished if you so desire. It's important to make sure you protect the miniature, so I use AK Interactive matte varnish to protect it as you handle it on the tabletop. But if you want to make it even more special and a bit more of a weathering and dirty effect, follow on now. So for this I'm using products by AK Interactive again, and the first one is AK014 Winter Streaking Grime. Now these products basically help you achieve sort of a dirtier look on the paintwork. So as you can see, I'm using a fine paintbrush, and I'm basically starting off at any bolts and rivets and pulling the paint down in a downward motion. I then use an alcohol, this time AK050 odorless thinner, and using a flat paintbrush, which I've dabbed off all the excess alcohol on my paper towelette. And basically you're helping to spread this streaking grime. What it's basically doing is sort of showing as the vehicle's been in the outdoor environment, and when water and rain has hit the paintwork, basically it's sort of getting a bit grimy and dirty as it flows off from these rivets, bolts, etc. And you can see I'm basically doing the same thing on the front of the miniature. And here, for example, because there's lots of like bolts in place, I'm picking on those in a downward motion, and then later on I'm then using the odorless thinner to basically help spread them and make them look a bit more natural. Now a key point is make sure you don't let the streaking grime dry in place. You want to be doing this relatively quickly, and it's up to you how grimy you want to make the tank look. I suggest when you start doing this, basically start off with the principle less is more, so do not go too crazy to start. And if you do find it's not grimy enough to your eye, then of course go over it again and do a bit more. Now we're actually doing the same process yet again, but this time with AK013 rust streaks. So as per the name, it's representing where rust is occurring. And what I'm doing here is really picking on the bolts again, because I'm sort of picturing the fact that they will rust the most. So be more prescriptive with the rust streaking grime than the previous product. Basically dab them in place, and then yet again go about with your alcohol soaked paintbrush and basically dab them in place, making it look a bit more natural. And again, to help you sort of conceptualize it, I'm doing it on the back of the tank, on the sort of the engine compartment, and here you can sort of, I'm picking on sort of the individual corners of the access points, or the access sort of grills into the tank engine. So yep, again, go about with your flat paintbrush with your alcohol on the brush, and basically dab it and spread that rusting effect. Alright, so there she is, all finished and ready for the tabletop. Hopefully looking quite nice, and as I said, just using the single paint scheme allows more effort to be done on the streaking effects and the weathering, and also the finer detail of the miniature. But yeah, as per some of the stills you can see here, you can see the nice effect of the sponge method for the weathering, and also the subtle effect the streaking has on the panels, the bolts and the rivets of the vehicle. Now, if you're wondering about the crew, the head of the lady crewman comes from the Cadian upgrade sprue, and likewise is the tank commander style chap pointing out to the right. They're both from the upgrade sprue. But yeah, so hopefully it was enjoyable and easy to follow and easy to execute. But any questions, put them in the comments, happy to answer them. And as I said at the start, all of the paints I use are listed below as well. But yep, if you enjoyed this video and want to support me, you can do so with a like, comment, or by subscribing, joining my Patreon platoon, or simply watching any of my other YouTube videos to which I cover hobby, tactics, and lore, all relating to Astra Militarum. So get your bayonet sharp, lads gun oiled. Faith in the Emperor strong. Patreon platoon, sound off. Tank Commander Glenn, Tank Commander Watchdog Van Etten, Tank Commander Mitchell, Colour Sergeant DuPont, Sergeants Adal, the Colonel Merrill, Veteran Gibson, Hall, Lundeen, Guardsman Beard, Coquelin, Flint, Hills, Malik, Nitton, Nguyen, Smith, Tom, Tompkin, Conscript England, Gilliam, Goodwin.